So this talk is on shaping communities and populations and some of the relationships that exist there. So first of all, a few terms that we need to kind of refresh ourselves on. Population, a group of the same species that live in one place at one time and interbreed. So what that means is, if we're talking about a population, we're talking about a population of dogs or of turtles. But we are not talking about turtles and dogs together. That is what we would call a community, because those two might interact with each other, the turtles and the dogs, but they're not part of the same population. So what we're looking at here is populations of individual species that live in one place at one time. And so we're going to define a couple parts here. One is exponential growth and one is logistical growth. And so the big difference between these two is exponential just keeps going upward really quickly. Whereas a logistical growth, they have a carrying capacity. So there's kind of a maximum carrying capacity to the animal in its environment. And then lastly, we'll talk about some abiotic and biotic factors. So for example, abiotic are non-living factors, if you remember that from before. So things like weather, soil conditions, things like that, how the temperature and all those things. Whereas biotic factors come down to food, animal interactions. And so if you want to think about this question is the effect of humans on populations of other organisms that we interact with, is that an abiotic or a biotic factor? So are we considered, which of those two are we considered? So that's something to think about. Now populations, again, a group of same species living together in the same place at the same time. So this would be a population of deer, for example, in this picture, because they are the same species and they live in the same area. Now, deer here in Minnesota, we might consider that population different than deer in North Dakota or the deer in Wisconsin. Those would be separate populations. So population growth is really defined two different ways. One is through exponential, which you can see here. This increases at a rapid pace, whereas with a logistical growth, it'll get to this sort of maximum and then level out. And so population size, again here, this is the formula, this is the exponential formula for growth. Notice that it just continues to get higher and higher. And then the logistical growth follows this model where it's going up. And what happens then sometimes it might be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, a little bit higher, lower, higher, lower. And it might waver down, but it'll eventually kind of level off at this carrying capacity. And so that's the most organisms that can live in an area. So what are some factors that affect these things? Well, biotic and abiotic factors. So this is part of the biotic factors. Biotic, of course, are the living factors in the area. Abiotic are things like the weather and the soil and the temperature and things like that. That will affect the organisms there as well. But biotic really plays a larger role. And that comes back to the food webs that we've talked about. And so one of the terms we'll use is predation. I think we're all pretty familiar with that, killing one organism for the other. What ends up happening is this co-evolution, where two different species might co-evolve with each other. So maybe one species becomes a little bit faster and better at hunting, well then the other organism maybe becomes better at hiding. Okay? And it might develop a trait that allows it to hide better, like a camouflage. Parasites are another way that there's a biotic factor. So in parasitism, there's a host and a parasite. So for example, fleas or tapeworm latch on to a larger species. And so the host species, like the dog in the case of fleas, and they have interaction with each other. And so generally in this, parasites, one organism feeds on another organism. It's similar to predation, but they generally don't kill the host. So a coevolution example of this might be that the host improves their immune system, or in the case of a dog, it might just begin the trait of scratching. Another term that we use is herbivore. So herbivore are animals that eat plants. This is pretty straightforward. Now plants co-evolve in that they might have spines or thorns or some nasty chemical compounds, secondary compounds, that don't allow the animals to eat that plant. It either hurts them through the spines or the chemical compounds make them sick or even possibly die. So a few other interactions. One is a symbiotic relationship. This is where two species live closely with each other. And so one of the examples of that is mutualism, where this is a relationship where both species benefit from the relationship that those organisms have. Commensalism, here on the bottom, it's kind of got cut off here. But commensalism basically says one organism benefits and one organism is unaffected. So mutualism is where both species benefit. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and one organism is basically unaffected. And so we'll cover a few of these in class. Make sure you go on and take the quiz after this and answer all the questions.